Good afternoon. I'm Anne-Marie Lipinski, the curator of the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard, and it's great to see you all here at the Walter Lippmann House. It's my tremendous pleasure to host this conversation today, one about how journalists are shaping the national and local narrative about Latino life in the United States. We're also very happy to be in partnership with our friends and colleagues at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. They've been hosting a broader conference called Crossing Borders, Immigration, and Gender in the Americas, of which this conversation is an extension. For those of you who are tweeting, hashtag Nieman, N-I-E-M-A-N. And yes, the grammar rule here is I before E except before Marcus. So, easy way to remember. Anyway, it's just really tremendously exciting to have these three journalists with us today, just an extraordinary group. And I wanted to introduce them briefly to you, and you'll get to learn a lot more about them as the conversation goes on. So I'll start on the far right with Laura Wides-Muñoz, who is the Hispanic Affairs writer for the Associated Press, where she has worked for over a decade. Laura's beat is one that she helped to create, and working from Miami, she has led the AP's coverage on the growth of Hispanic media, Latinos' rising political influence, U.S.-Cuba relations, and other stories. During her year as a Nieman Fellow at Harvard, which she is this year, Laura has worked to elevate her knowledge of beyond the social, cultural, and political aspects to include the economic side of the equation. That's where she's been spending most of her studies. Laura's from Washington and attended Brown University, where she graduated with honors. She was drawn to journalism while on a Fulbright fellowship studying something totally unrelated, renewable energy in Guatemala. But after witnessing and learning about human rights violations during the Civil War, felt very compelled to turn her path toward journalism, which she's been doing brilliantly ever since. Isaac Lee is president of news for Univision Communications, a leading Spanish language media company serving Hispanic America. His responsibilities extend across Univision's portfolio to include editorial programming and production in the company's television group, radio, and its digital platforms. His efforts to increase Latinos' voice in the American conversation have included, most recently, a joint venture with ABC News to launch Fusion, a 24-hour English language news network aimed at Latinos. He has expanded Univision's news to include investigative and documentary units, and for the first time in the company's 50-year history, Univision News began offering English language content, which it publishes on its digital platform. And Maria Hinojosa is the president of Futuro Media Group, the anchor and executive producer of Latino USA, which airs on National Public Radio, and host of WGBH's Maria Hinojosa One-on-One. She's a very familiar voice, literally, to anyone who has been following coverage of overlooked immigrant stories. She walked in and she said, I think we've met. And I said, I've known you forever, whether we have or not. Her coverage has included stories on immigrant work camps in New Orleans following Katrina to teenage victims of sexual harassment on the job. The documentary Child Brides, Stolen Lives received the Edward R. Murrow Award from the Overseas Press Club for Best Documentary. She's the author of 2 books, Raising Raul, Adventures in Raising Myself and My Son, and Cruise, Gang Members Talk to Maria Hinojosa. Maria was born in Mexico City and raised in Chicago, where she's now teaching at DePaul University as chair of the Latin American and Latino Studies program. So welcome to all three of you. Thank you so much for joining us here today. So I wanted to start really with a question about a basic building block in journalism, and that is language, words, what we call, what we see, what names we put to the things that we're describing. And I was thinking about it because This week again, another news organization made news just by announcing that it would no longer use the term illegal immigrants. This week it was the Los Angeles Times, which said it will no longer use that term or the term undocumented immigrants, but instead will describe a person's circumstances. So it actually articulated the way in which that might be done. For instance, authorities said he crossed the border illegally, or she entered the country to attend college but overstayed her student visa, or he was brought here as a child by his parents who entered the U.S. without a visa. Before that, recently the AP announced the same thing. Before that, it was the New York Times. 5 years ago, the paper in San Antonio made the same announcement. And my question really is twofold. One is, why does that matter? And is the conversation about that the same in English as it is in Spanish? Some of you write in English, some of you in Spanish, some of you represent an organization that does both. And the other part of that question is, if it's important, is it also deceptive? Does it look like more progress when we have headlines about something that simple than is really warranted? And I'll start at the end with Laura, since your news organization just debated and decided that very recently, and you are the person who's been executing those, those habits and fashions over the years.
Well, just to start, full disclosure, I was not privy to the decision to change the nomenclature, so I can't speak to exactly why AP decided now. But having covered the issue for many years, it's very interesting to me in one side, because in fact on our Spanish language side, we'd actually not been using in many instances the term illegal immigrant. It was sin documentos, indocumentado, without documents. So in some ways, we're bringing our entire organization in line together, which I think is definitely progress. And I think it does reflect, as the head of AP talked about, sort of a move away from labels in general to more describing people, and then whatever characteristics they have, whether we're talking about, someone who's instead of a schizophrenic, someone who's schizophrenic, has schizophrenia. But clearly, it's not a coincidence that, in 2012 and there was an election in which Latinos came out and made their voice heard. And also, the census shows a tremendous shift. And I think, as Maria Hinojosa will say, the numbers tell the story. And I think when you have enough of a concentrated group, enough of an influence, it forces everybody in the community from top down to rethink the way they do things and the way they're viewing the world.
Isaac?
Sure. Hi, thank you very much for having me here. It's a big pleasure. We care a lot about the words that are used, and we are offended when undocumented Hispanics are called illegals. We had a strong discussion about that with the New York Times, and I was invited by the AP to be in a panel discussion when they were launching their new style book, style guide, and had a difference with them of opinion, and I think it's a human rights issue. I think it's much more than just a word. And when we look back in 20 or 30 years, we're really not going to believe that some of us were using illegal to describe a person. I think that an action can be illegal. Someone can do something that is illegal, but I cannot see how can a person be illegal. Our point with the New York Times when we were talking about it was precisely that, yes, it was okay at some point in articles that they published to refer to someone as a Negro or as a homo, and we cannot believe that we used to do that. And to me, it's just the same. It is as offensive and as big a mistake as that. and we need to be very respectful of people. So that is like what really matters in principle. And besides that, I think that to insult a powerful community that is voting, deciding elections, and has more than $1 trillion of purchasing power is just dumb business.
Are the values around terminology or nomenclature relatively similar when you're publishing or broadcasting in English or Spanish, or do they vary?
I think that people are much more sensible to these things when it's in Spanish. We never really had to even ask ourselves if we call someone illegal or not, because we just don't do. I mean, we are writing to them. When we shifted into English, we understood that there was a discussion, and we were part of it.
So Maria, part of the question, I'd be interested in your take on it, is whether this is sort of a false sense of progress, or is this real? Does our debate and our focus on this kind of thing actually inform where these stories are headed and how the nation thinks about these issues?
Yeah, I just want to say that I totally agree with what Isaac was saying, in the sense that this is, in our country, somehow if you are talking about Latino issues, somehow it becomes that you have an agenda, or if you're talking about immigrant issues, you have an agenda. And it's like, actually, no, we're talking about an American agenda, if you will, in the sense that let's just talk about due process and what our Constitution feels like when we accept the fact that we are talking about having a sector of people that we call illegal. So I always, I look at it much more in these broader terms, that it's not just about the Latino immigrant or other immigrant groups. It's really about who we are as a country and who we are as a nation in the context of the world. So what was my moment when I was like, pero claro? It was when I met Elie Wiesel at the New York bureau at CNN. And I asked him, because I was struggling with this, because I was at CNN at the time. Oh, whoops, sorry. Boy, it's good that we're not on live TV right now. So I stopped him and I just said, Mr. Wiesel, please help me understand what is the correct terminology and what am I saying to my bosses? And he just said, Maria, the Nazis declared the Jews to be an illegal people. Mm-hmm. That was the first thing they did. They declared the Jews to be an illegal people. And the next, and having done interviews with people who were covering or living in the, Guerra Sucia, the dirty wars in Argentina or Chile, and that people would be like, no, that's not happening. No, there's nobody disappearing. You're crazy. And journalists were writing about this. So I think we have to be aware of the fact that this is a historical context that we're in, and that as journalists, we have to have, the broadest desire to represent the truth in a word. And when I've spoken about this publicly, también, in agreement with Isaac, I have said, so people understand, have you ever broken the law? Do you know anybody who's in your family who's broken the law? Of course, because my eyes landed on you, and then people are going to be like, yeah, like I got a speeding ticket, or then, like my uncle got a DUI, and, who knows? There's families are complicated. I said, well, that would mean that then your uncle is forever an illegal driver because he had a stop for a DUI. He's an illegal driver, or your cousin stopped paying their taxes and they're now an illegal taxpayer. It's like, that's grammatically incorrect. And so as journalists, we want to be as correct as we possibly can, but it's about what it means for the rest of us that somehow this terminology is used. Y para terminar, completely sure that in 20 years, people are going to look back and they were like, you were using those terms? You were actually using those terms? You use those terms? Are you kidding? No. We use those terms.
So I wanted to talk about to hear you talk about one of the abiding narratives of our last national election was the meaningful increase in organized Latino voting and an increased recognition, which had been fair in Washington, but was now on the rise outside of Washington, about the power of the Latino vote, in a sense, even among conservative politicians, that immigration reform was no longer an elective, but necessary to the future success of either political party. And I'm curious to hear from all of you how you think that story was covered. What did the narrative leave out? Did it get the basic structure about right? Did it not? And I'm also curious how differently you think it was covered in the English language press versus the Spanish language media. Any of you?
I'll start again. I think it was covered. I mean, certainly mainstream media got it, but there were some big holes that I think came to light very, very late in the game. And one, for example, was the vast number of Puerto Ricans in Florida who have moved there either from the island or from New York and other states, and for many years weren't voting because they recently moved for many, many complicated reasons, cultural, political, socioeconomic, were not voting, but had been tapped by the Obama campaign and had in fact sort of acculturized enough to Florida that they had now registered and were becoming more politically active and getting tapped in by the local organizations. And they turned out in high numbers. And that was sort of a surprise to people. And it was right there. It really shouldn't have been. But for example, I went to a reunion, a meeting of Puerto Ricans across parties right before the election in the spring of 2012. And there was almost no media. There probably was Spanish language media there, but not even very much. And this was a group of about 300 people from both sides of the political spectrum all together. And they were engaged and trying to help each other figure out how to run campaigns. And these were community leaders and folks from all walks of life. And it would have been a great group to tap into and a great event to cover. And it just got zero play.
We did a half-hour special for PBS precisely about the people who I consider the most powerful Latinos in the United States, which are the Latinos, the Puerto Ricans, and other citizens in Central Florida, because they can determine the future. And we spent several days there and did a half-hour special, and what I came away with was the complexity of the Latino voter, which again is so fascinating. But this notion that somehow there's one way in which we vote. So let me give you an example of she was 22 years old. Her mom was Venezuelan, her dad was Puerto Rican. They met as students in Tennessee. And then they moved to Central Florida. They're deeply Catholic, very engaged Catholics, but pro-life social justice Catholics. And so for her, the question was, I'm completely pro-life, but I believe in justice, and justice after the child is born. And so the story around, where she was going to put her vote, which was going to ultimately be for Obama. And there was a lot of stuff going on, a lot of activities that we were there. And again, I didn't see a lot of media at these events. So, and I've done that story now I did that story in 2000 and, when was it? 2006, 2008, when I was now on PBS. So we've already done it a bit, but it's kind of surprising that that's not the big national story. I guess that the thing that mattered to me about this vote is that Latinos did not decide to stay at home. And with the number of deportations at this rate and the anger, that there was not this, we're staying at home and we just, because to have that happening with a generation that is then being raised or raising a younger generation, and they're seeing their parents and cousins and uncles saying, no, ¿por qué voy a votar? The way I saw it in Mexico, it was like, votar, ¿para qué? You don't want that happening with the fastest growing demographic in our country. Because again, it's not just what is mattering to those Latinos, it what matters to the country. This is among the fastest growing demographic next to the Asians. So we need to make sure that they are engaged in the democracy at every level, from the media to the voting, to the streets, to every level. I'm a democracy junkie, what can I tell you?
Isak, what about that story? Had we all been following it on Univision, would we have understood in a different way than for those of us who were reading it in the English language press in this country?
First, I want to mention that the Presidential Commission for the Debates did not include a Latino journalist and did not think that it was meaningful to have a debate in Spanish to address 52 million people. And, you know, it's just unbelievable. There's a huge community that has special issues, and they can tilt the way the election goes, and they thought it was non-relevant.
Do you imagine that would be different in 4 years?
No doubt. No, well, the candidates were much smarter. We addressed them directly, invited them to Univision for a forum, and they both came. You know, they know that they need to win. But it was unbelievable to see that a presidential commission there in Washington, when they sit down to decide how we should, you know, consume media, can ignore 52 million people. And as a Latino, but also as a Latin American, it was very disappointing to see that during the presidential debates, the word Mexico was not mentioned once. Once. It's our biggest trade partner, the country that influences us the most, and, you know, Mexico? Mm-mm.
I bet they mentioned it, though, when they showed up at Univision.
Of course. Of course.
So talk about that. What was that like? And how did it differ from what we saw in the national debates?
For us, was very important because it made English language media aware that we do real journalism. Our anchors were much tougher, the questions were much better, and the candidates were much more uncomfortable because they were actually asked the right questions. There were no rules, and nobody was pretending to, Jorge and Maria Elena are still alive, which was a difference, and so it was a lively conversation, a lively debate, and that makes a difference. Now, Univision has a special characteristic. We do not report to the left like MSNBC or the right like Fox News or the nobodies like CNN. We report to the community. We are representing a community, and we take it very seriously. And that is a huge responsibility when you're sitting there. And one of the things that impressed me the most is when I joined Univision and I was learning who the audience was and who I was working for actually. I saw that 72% of our audience is unduplicated, which is unbelievable. I mean, it means that they only watch Univision and nothing else. And so imagine the responsibility that you feel when you know that they're going to watch either Univision or Univision. It's not that they are choosing to listen to what the left has to say, or no, they believe you. So you have to take it very seriously.
Go ahead, Laura.
I just wanted to add one thing. I don't really disagree with anything that's been said so far, but I think one other important aspect of this election was, as with basically the population in general, there was a lot of work to get folks involved on the ground and to get the youth involved in social media. And I think people were already interested just because youth in general are more likely to take to social media. But I think once that was really encouraged and spread, I don't think people go back from there. And so I do think you have new networks and more activated sort of associations. And I think, even, for example, when the Dreamers got up there and sort of got in Romney's face, and it was on TV, and first it was on Univision, then it was on, Univision in English, and then they put up their own video, and then other major media sites got it. That was something that these kids, with some help, had really pushed for, and I think that also was new, and I think that also empowered people and sort of changed the game a little bit in terms of who was speaking for people, whether it be in English and mainstream or in Spanish language media.
I think one of the, again, if you look at this in the context of just the general principles of democracy in our country, one of the stories that I think was missed was the fact that what really pushed the Obama administration to move on deferred action was when the Dreamers started taking over Obama campaign headquarters in different states. And they were doing basic grassroots, civil disobedience, a la, everything that President Obama quotes, the suffragettes, the civil rights movement, the feminists, et cetera. This is exactly what they were doing. And that was the response of the Obama administration, was to do DACA. There's a whole other side of it, which is that the desperation is such, right, from so many people feeling completely disempowered that given DACA, they're going to take DACA. Is DACA really, is it really what people want? Is it effective? What is it really saying? And I think that's a historical moment that we're living in, which is that in Spanish, estamos tan desesperados, that you'll just take anything. You're just so desperate, you'll just take anything. And that's not a good place for anybody to be in, or for journalists to kind of be living through, because I don't think that serves anybody well.
If I can say something else, I think we're still looking at this in a very superficial level. We are debating, but how many years should they, stay before we give them the right to and the fine, and should we allow
and how
them
long
to...
it took to write it? It's like, hello, it's been since 1986. Hello.
And so the fact that in many states Hispanic kids cannot go to public school is absolutely crazy. The people that think, college. I'm sorry. It's absolutely crazy. And if those politicians think that they're punishing the Hispanic community, they should really learn a little bit of demographics. When 1 out of 3 babies that are being born is a Hispanic, you are affecting the GDP of your country, not a community. There should be a higher level conversation to understand what's good for all of us as Americans, and not to decide how to punish or not a specific community.
I'd love to hear a discussion about how you choose where to focus. I mean, to your point, Maria, this isn't a monolith we're talking about as we use the term community, but it's not monolithic. So I was looking at where each of your news organizations put some emphasis this week. So, AP publishes something it calls, the big story online, and this week, Immigration Debate Creates Dilemma for Obama. Your website today is focusing on, what can Obama really accomplish in the conversation about Mexico. And your homepage today has the lead story is about the Boston bombings and news or noise, sort of a conversation about media coverage of that story. I'd be curious, and I know, Laura, you're on leave and you weren't responsible for the decision, but it'd be interesting to hear you talk about where you decide to place emphasis on any given day or in any given period of news coverage. There are some clear distinctions in what each of your news organizations were doing this week.
The President of the United States is in Mexico today, so we better talk about that. And they are going to talk about immigration reform, the drug on wars, where there is a major shift, trade, security at the border, new energy policy, and all of that is going to affect this country very, very much. not to have in the front page or in the home page of a website the fact that the president is in Mexico talking to the new president of Mexico is a huge mistake for any journalist, period.
But it kind
So
of
the reason why
analytic-
we're doing that is just so you know, our website goes live, I think, tonight. And it has our front page is going to be all about, and this show is actually dedicated to Mexico. And we interviewed former Ambassador Arturo Sarucan about the perspective of what's the delicate balance with the United States and Mexico. And then we actually go behind the scenes and get a journalist's take on being a pocho in Mexico. And we have a piece about, to give it some kind of context, we were in Mexico on a delegation documenting violence against women in Mexico. So we actually did the news at the top, and then because we're a weekly show, spend a little bit of time giving context. So I'm sorry that it wasn't up when you looked.
And if Laura wouldn't be on Lib, the big story on AP would be on Mexico too.
Well, there may be, my guess is there's a few stories on
Oh,
Mexico
okay,
today,
just-
more than a few. Thank you. But I do think that one of the challenges that we have as such a big organization is sort of balancing how much of the coverage of Latinos we're giving to immigration, because clearly, undocumented, it's a very small portion of the overall Latino group, and certainly even a small portion of the immigrant group. And so there's that balance to how much we're giving to sort of, I don't want to say positive images, but other stories that are related to business, that are related to entertainment, arts, culture, sports, politics. The fact that Ted Cruz is considering running for president maybe in 2016. So I think there's that balance, and I think this is something that all of our organizations face, and this is something that I've thought a lot about, is sort of that tug of war between the individual stories of immigrants and immigration and sort of the Washington, is this going to be a problem for Obama? Is he up? Is he down? This, that. And I think there's a space in there that we can do a better job of, and that we're starting to do, which is bridging those gaps between the individual stories and some of the broader economic themes that are facing our country that have almost as much to do with class and economics, socioeconomics, as they do with immigration. I mean, we're losing low-skilled jobs, and many immigrants who are coming in are low-skilled workers. So we have more people coming in. We have people already here. What are we doing to provide work for Latinos who came in 50 years ago, as well as those who are coming now? And I think those are harder to grasp and harder to carve out in a one afternoon big story even. But there are the stories that we need to keep doing and do more of.
I wanted to ask one more question of you all before we open it up to others to ask some questions. And that is about just sort of a general sense of a report card. Maria, we were talking before we came in here. You were recalling the first time that you voiced a story in, I think you said 1985, and it was a rally outside an INS building. And you ended the story as you were relating it to us by saying, we've gone backwards since then. Tell me a little bit more about that, and then I'd be curious to hear from our other two panelists about that as well.
Because in 1986, we didn't have SB 1070, and we didn't have a Supreme Court that had basically said it's okay to stop someone who you believe could be in the country without papers. And we all know what that means. So I think that we have fewer Latino journalists working in the mainstream than we did then. I think that there is the number of hate crimes against Latinos increasing at numbers that are huge, and the untold stories that we're not hearing about, people who are getting attacked or not going to the doctor or not going to the school for any reason or their fears. So I know it's a downer. Ugh, I hate being Debbie Downer. But I do, I'm optimistic. It's going to get better sometime soon. But I think that it's a problem now. I think that we can't walk away from the numbers again. You know, Latina teenagers have the highest rate of attempted suicide in our country right now. Mental health and depression among our people are very high growing. Families that are separated. We have a whole generation that we need to know a lot more about, a generation of young people who are separated from their parents. It's a whole new dynamic. And it makes me sad because, again, what you want is to have news organizations across the board that are hungry to be reporting these stories because it's good journalism and it's smart business. But I think that if you go back to the language thing, there are consequences for what happens when people go on television and they demonize a people, and when the media gives free rein to that. It's language. It's
You mean like
terminology.
self-deportation?
Por ejemplo, or on CNN, the consistency of Lou Dobbs for ever many years, and when I said to them, you don't want to do this, and they said nothing's ever going to happen. Yes, stuff happens. So it's probably going to get worse before it gets better, and we've got to dig ourselves out of a place because this didn't just happen immediately. And I think like what Isaac said about the fact that Mexico wasn't mentioned in the presidential debates, and it's kind of like, well, you can't talk about Mexico, and it's like, what? How did that happen? How did that happen? That somehow bringing in Mexico or Mexicans or something is like, hot button issue. It's like that's ridiculous. But a lot of that comes from the fact that Latino USA, yes, Univision, yes, Laura, but in essence, there has been a void in this kind of reporting, and we are suffering the consequences.
Isaac?
I don't know if I have a clear answer.
So you're running an operation that didn't exist when Maria covered that INS story. You seem to be booming. You've done a deal with a major network. You're now publishing in 2 languages. You're, the multimedia, sort of poster child. I would think that you would have a fairly optimistic view of the state of coverage.
I do. I mean, I am incredibly lucky to be leading Univision News now. We are maybe the only news organization in the country that is growing in ratings and doing incredibly well. Our viewers have told us through ratings that they care about investigations and investigative reporting, documentaries, and now we are focusing on a demographic that we did not before, which are the Hispanic millennials that are culturally Hispanic, that care about their roots, but that their main language is English. And it's incredibly interesting for us and very interesting as well to be able to launch a news network in this day and age. So I am incredibly optimistic about that, about the coverage of Latino issues or the participation of Latinos in general media, not so much. But I do feel that I am at a perfect time, at a perfect place. It doesn't get better.
Just to play devil's advocate for Maria, I think I agree that this is a very difficult time, and I would definitely agree with Isaac that we need many, many more Latinos and Latinas in the media and in the editors' chairs, because at the end of the day, I can pitch a story, but if my editor says, why will Susan Jones in Ohio care, without realizing that Susan Jones is married to Estuardo Gomez, it's a hard sell.
Or in love with.
Or in love with. So I think, I think that really, truly matters, and I think that is something that we need to focus on. But I'm also heartened by some signs that I see in terms of there are more sites. There are more internet sites that are dedicated to Latinos. I know AP has beefed up its coverage both in Spanish and English. Now, whether we get it right every time, no, we don't. But we're getting better. And I think that you know, more the merrier. It's good. It's a good thing. I think I'm wary because there are certain companies that have one message for Latinos and one message for the mainstream, and I won't name names, but if you look at the day that AP announced that it was dropping the illegal immigrant term, on websites owned by the same company, one side used a picture of these guys turned away trying to climb up a fence, and then the one for the Latinos used a picture of women, saying nobody's illegal and sort of looking sunny, and that. So I'm worried about sort of micro focusing and whether that divides our audiences even more and divides the message and sort of dilutes the message. But on the whole, I think there is more effort to try to cover America as it is now, and to understand that it's not even just covering America, that we're covering shifting populations that go beyond, geographic borders, that are related throughout Latin America and even to Spain and Europe and other ways. So I am encouraged, but I think, we need to do more, and I think we need to make sure that it's not the Hispanic affairs writer that's doing more, but the legal affairs writer, the economics writer, the health and medicine writer, that it's trickling down and it's out to everyone, whether you're in Spanish language media or not.
So I'm going to open up questions to the larger group. I would just ask that you could introduce yourself before you ask the question. Borja?
Hi, I'm Borja Echevarria. I'm a Spanish journalist, Nieman Fellow this year, and managing editor at El País in Spain. So I just checked the New York Times. There's not a single word in the whole page about Mexico. Not a single word at this moment. Not in the USA Today.
You still use illegal immigrant, I believe.
Yes, they do.
So my question is for Isaac, but for all of you, do you see this, mostly for Univision, as a big opportunity for a place like, or do you really need mainstream media like the New York Times to get much more involved in this news? And if you could explain what was your approach for the agreement with ABC News?
Sure. Hola, Borja. Look, the cake is huge. We don't need it all for us. we can share. So yes, they are leaving it all for us, and I don't think that if they realize that they are losing readers and advertisers and time, they can actually do better. There are some media companies that are really having a hard time adapting to change, and change is not just digital change; it's demographic change too. Like my friend here was saying, hello, 17% of the population today, 30% in 2060. We should start to, engage them. We are thrilled by the opportunity to reach Hispanic millennials. And ABC News is a great partner. It's the Walt Disney Company. And we realized that there's this whole generation of kids that like Shakira, that want to eat, with their abuelas, that love Latin food, that care about immigration because their cousin or their aunt or their uncle can be deported, that care about what's going on in Mexico because, the dad or the mother is still there, or they were born there, or they want to go back to Mexico one day, or half of the family is there, and so it matters to them. And they care about Latin America. And although immigration is not the most important issue for Latinos, it becomes very political, and many people don't understand why. And it is because nobody wants to be insulted. It doesn't matter if you're undocumented or or an American citizen, when they are insulting a whole community, you care. No, so I'm Jewish and I'm an American. So if they say something about Jewish people that are not American, I'll take it personally too. It's not the opportunity is amazing. The numbers are very, very big. Our community is 10 years younger in median age than white Caucasians, and the number of millennials is actually a little bit more than 20%, while the percentage of the population is around 16.5 to 17. So there is a larger number of young Latinos there, and they over-index big time in all digital, in social media, in adapting to technology, in using smartphones. It is going to be truly the first digital network. The second screen is actually the first screen, and the way to reach to them is completely different. And one of the difficult conversations that I have had with our parent companies when we have to explain what we're doing is, well, but with what you described, doesn't seem like a news network. And well, it's not for you. It's for millennials. And what is news for them, it's different. And we are going to give them the news that they consider it's news, in the format that they want to consume it. And so that creates a different conversation. And I don't know if I answer your question or not, but it's...
This gentleman here.
My name is Arturo Reynoso, independent, I guess. I wonder, Isaac, when you're trying to balance the news or any segment of something that you want to present to the public about the Latino community, Hispanic community, what is the balance between the negativeness, the problems that we have as a community, and the progress that we are making? For instance, give you an example. I'm a public radio. Maria, one of my idols out there. There is a guy who just won the primaries here who is Latino, I guess. Mm-hmm. And I haven't seen anything really coming out of the community saying, gee, we have a shot at a solution here as a potential senator from Massachusetts who is Latino, who may be able to say something about the Dreamers or something like that. So what is the balance in there?
Well, he has been interviewed extensively and he has been talking about it. He's not saying much yet. We know that he is a former Navy SEAL and that he has a story to tell. But when you ask him clearly about issues like gun control and immigration, and he doesn't have yet his answers ready. He will be asked a lot. And in terms of balancing, I just think that we don't need to be balancing. News is what it is. If there's a good story, it's a good story. If it's a negative story, it's a negative story. And if we try to balance, we'll be making a mistake. We do not need to be treated with a handicap. Like, no, we need to balance and not tell them the whole truth because, what...
But yet, you're ready, just I'm sure. They want to get the stuff that is going to be sold in the public. The owners of the papers want to represent the community as they see it, not as we see it, as the millennials see it, as the opportunities that they have to be a Gomez or something like that, to move forward in this society. We don't own the media. We are, puppets really in a lot of different ways.
Not really. We at media companies, really the real owner, the boss is the audience. We work for you guys. If you don't watch us, if you don't read us, we don't matter.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
Watch us.
I'm going to stand up so that everybody can hear me. My name is Tanya Perez-Brennan. I'm a freelance journalist, and I write for Fox News Latino, but I'm not here representing Fox News Latino. I'm here as an independent voice. And I have a two-part question. By the way, I just did a profile on Gabriel Gomez, so I can talk to you about that if you want to talk about that. One thing that bothered me, today I read in the Boston Globe that they referred to Gabriel Gomez, who is the son of Colombian immigrants. The quote was something like, the son of Latino immigrants, and that really bothered me. Because I said, well, what does that mean? What is a Latino immigrant? The son of Colombian immigrants? Right. So there's this whole difference between Latino and Latin American, and Isaac, you said, and if I can quote you, you said, as a Latino, but also as a Latin American. And I feel like there's a lack of understanding about the diversity of the Latino experience, and I think some of that falls on the shoulders of the Latino journalists out there. This is not a monolithic group, obviously, and in my reporting at least, I try to sort of denote blah, 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 who is from Guatemala, blah, 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 who is from Nicaragua, blah, 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 who is from Colombia, because it is different, blah, 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 who is Puerto Rican. That's totally different, right? So one thing is to comment on sort of how, as Latino journalists who cover Latinos, how we can sort of bring about diversity in our coverage, number one. And number two is just the issue of diversity in general in newsrooms, which Laura touched on a little bit. But I can tell you from personal experience, this is the first time in my life that I have Latino editors who get it. Because my whole life I've been writing for, I don't know what else to call it, the mainstream white media, and I had to fight with editors. I used to work for the Orlando Sentinel down in Central Florida, and I used to work for the Florida Times-Union in Jacksonville, and I had to fight with editors because they refused to put accents on Spanish surnames. And I said, if you do not put an accent on my name, on Perez, it is misspelled. So there's also the pressure on Latinos to sort of represent and to sort of fight to get our stories out there.
Excellent, yeah.
To put it in a broader perspective, so I'd be curious about how you think about that. I mean, and this goes back to language and nomenclature, and how, when we say Latinos, how that differs from when we say African Americans or white males or, gay men, or pick your term.
You know what? It's very interesting because we had somebody come in for a job interview who was not Latino, and they started listening to Latino USA, and they were just like, you kind of used some terms that I didn't know, and which is like fine, right? I mean, she grew up in New Jersey. She didn't know, so she was like, Chicano, what does that look like? And it made me start thinking that one of the things that we're going to do in our new website when we relaunch is to perhaps have a glossary, because there's an assumption, right, that everybody knows. Everybody who's watching Univision knows. But other people, and I think that that's a role like for a show like Latino USA, is that we are also giving the complexity to other Latinos so that the Latinos understand we get it, we understand the complexity. But for the others, there's a lack of understanding, not for anything, but just because we're busy, who knows? They've never had somebody who can answer that conversation. So what exactly is a Chicano? And you're only a Latino if you live in the United States, right? You're not a Latino when you're living in Bolivia. And it's like, right. But who's having those conversations? So I, again, where are the editors who are saying, that's a great piece. Like, let's have that piece on the front page. So what exactly is a Latino? We're doing that on Latino USA all the time. We have a whole conversation called Somos where we talk about this internally. So what are we exactly? But we're bringing other people in the conversation, right? Because this is the futuro. So people have got to come to understand this complexity. So as the journalists who are documenting, yeah, we have to be giving this information and not necessarily assume that anybody gets it, but at the same time, not look like we don't get it, because that's not good either.
Laura or Isaac?
Please.
Well, just to address the accent, I think I wrote a story a number of years, actually seems way too long ago, called Accents Please, where I explored why the AP doesn't use accents, Spanish language accents. I kept wondering, because my married name is Munoz, and without it, it's Munoz, which sounds silly. So, but it could be worse. Your name could be turned into, a bad word without an accent. So it was actually quite interesting because it both brought up to me that there was technical problems because we have millions of clients and not everybody had the computer technology at the time to handle the accent and translate it into the right characters. So when they put their paper to bed, it immediately came out correctly. On the other hand, I don't think that much energy had been invested to make sure that was possible because it just wasn't really considered a priority. And I think, that's a little bit of how things are. There hasn't been that maybe the energy invested because it hasn't been considered a priority, but there are some hurdles to get over, but I think we can get over them. And I think, just getting back to language, it does matter. Do we want to spend our whole time discussing Latino, Hispanic? God, no, shoot me. But let's talk about the issues. But at the same time, how you envision people, what the images you say are reflective of what you're hearing, and that does matter. And those are conversations that tend to go on more in newsrooms when, let's just say, not everybody is a white guy. I mean, and that's not to say that some of my most progressive and most inclusive and supportive editors haven't been white guys, because they have, definitely. But more, and this goes with women and African Americans and everybody. I mean, we need a more diverse newsroom, clearly. And as there are fewer journalists representing everybody in general, we need that even more because there's just fewer of us out there.
Can I just say that reading Peña Nieto and not having the ñ was just like, I was like, ugh,
Pena.
Pena. It's like, what?
Which
And then
in English means pain. I mean,
No, ashamed.
Ashamed.
Pena, yeah,
Pena,
like a pena.
like
It's
ashamed.
not like a
Pena,
shame.
But the fact is that they didn't know, and it just, that I think that's what gets upsetting to you, is that just like, wow, we really need to be in these newsrooms and yet no one is there. And mistakes are made, and what it just says is that the lack of representation, it's frustrating.
On a positive side, we hired as chief programming officer of Fusion a white guy, and he's a minority. And we call him the white guy. So.
Is that with or without an accent?
No accent.
No accent. Yes.
Hi, my name is Anna. I'm a scientist, actually, and I'm trying to learn about journalism because I wanted to spread the word of science correctly. And because I'm a Latina, I'm very interested in reaching out in my community. So,
Where do you study?
I'm a microbiologist. I was very surprised by what you say, Isaac, about not having Latinos journalists being called for covering the news in the elections. And as you say, it's a dumb business, and they might have the numbers. They know how much we are. So why they don't pay attention to us? Is this a stereotype of Latinos? Are they just these people watching telenovelas, and so they don't count? And what Univision is doing, and what we should do as a community to tell them we are smart people, we vote, we really want to get involved.
That's the question. Yes. Well, I think that what we have to do is vote and express our opinions and let everybody know that we're not invisible.
And what Univision is doing about it?
Many telenovelas. Look, in terms of news, what we're doing is growing the news department and starting a documentary unit and bringing a prestigious investigative unit and bringing really good journalists and creating a new network for millennials. So we are doing everything we can within the boundaries of a business reality.
Sam.
My name's Sam Lowenberg, and I was a Nieman Fellow last year. I wanted to ask how much, how do you define your foreign reporting? If you're reporting about events in Latin America, what are you looking for? What are you trying to bring to audiences here? What do you think? What do you think's important that they need to know? And what if you understand what I mean?
I do. It's the question for me?
Yeah, I guess for you and Maria.
it's a combination of what is news and what the audience cares about Latin America. So, you know, there are places that are more newsworthy than others, and there are events that make it really newsworthy. So we spend a lot of time with Chavez, and you know, if he was dead or alive, and if he would die, who would replace him, and what was going to happen. And now we have spent time with Maduro, and if there's a crisis, and if he's going to be able to hold on or not, etc. And it's not because there are many Venezuelans, it is because it's news. And we also are very aware that the majority of our audience is Mexican. And Jorge and Maria Elena are both Mexican. And we report whatever it's important about Mexico. And also, we cover stories because of their news value. You know, so it's really not much about the foreign reporting or not. Now, our audience cares about international news much more than the regular American audience, which is amazing, but it's true.
How do you know that?
We have research.
There's actually great international coverage. I mean, like, whenever you watch Univision News, you come away understanding more about what's going on in the world than if you watch the evening news.
I think that, I don't doubt that. And in fact, one of the questions I had was whether or not your audience might be better served in terms of international coverage at a time when so many English language news organizations have pulled back from that. I guess what I was pushing on is this notion that your viewers or readers are more interested than readers of mainstream, consumers of mainstream media, and I don't know that that's true. I think it's an assumption organizations have made as they've gone about cutbacks, but...
No, it's not an assumption. It's based on research and polls. And I don't think that we do such a great job in international coverage other than Latin America. In fact, in this new partnership with ABC News, there is an understanding that if news happens somewhere in the world that it's not Latin America, we're going to rely on them. And if it's news about our community and Latin America, they will rely on us. I think we're pretty aware of what we know and also what we don't know. If there's, you know, a crisis in Syria or a problem in Somalia, I don't think we pretend to be able to do a better job than CNN. But if there was a Mexican soldier serving in the U.S. Army involved in a crisis in Syria, that's our story, and that story we know how to do because it matters and it matters to us. And so when Senator Giffords was shot, the news for mainstream media was that she was shot. The news for us is that she was saved by a Hispanic.
So it's a very disciplined approach to what the story is.
It's not even disciplined. It just makes so much sense, you don't have to think about it.
Other questions?
Did I answer your
Mary Beth?
question? Kind of.
Hi, I'm Mary Beth Sheridan. I'm a Nieman Fellow. I work for the Washington Post. I worked in Columbia a long time ago.
Yes, I know, Mary Beth, of course.
So I have a question. I used to cover immigration at the Washington Post, and it seems to me there's a tension you find sometimes in covering immigration, in that the stories of individual immigrants, particularly referring to those in the country, you know, illegally, are often quite sympathetic. I mean, they're people who come because to make a better life, to buy medicine for their ailing mother, to put their little sister through school. I mean, you know, they endure all sorts of things. I mean, they're often quite sympathetic. And yet, at the same time, if you're talking about the problem of illegal immigration, right? I mean, you presume that the country needs an immigration system that has certain rules and isn't simply kind of, you know, there's some discipline, some decisions on who comes in, et cetera, right? So I think if your audience is a Latino audience and you're somewhat of an advocate for them in a way, how do you handle what is, these are both pieces of the same story, and how do you kind of deal with the part that, despite what may be very tragic and beautiful human stories, it also makes sense for the government to have a system that's got some structure and discipline and choices about who comes and who doesn't.
I agree with you, and we deal with it like that. We don't encourage people to come and live to the U.S. Without documents. We don't do that. But we are also aware that there's a 12 million person problem, that you can go back to the roots and you can see if there's an immigration problem or not, but it's a fact. And it's a fact that has to be dealt with. And we're focusing on the solution, not on what created the problem. Now, you know that the rate now, it's actually zero. There's more people going back to Mexico than coming into the US. And this is a globalized world. It's all affected by the economy. If there are no jobs here, there are no people coming here. If the Mexican economy is doing better, people are going to be back. What I don't like is the hypocrisy of the conversation in terms of, but we first have to secure the border. How many people are coming through the border? Most of the people stay, they overstay on their visas. It's like, yeah, we can have excuses about the border, but how much is the border a problem? You want to really care about homeland security? Go check the ports. Look what can come in a container. Sorry?
No, I think about that all the time. In Miami, there's these huge containers, and I always think we have all these people looking to make sure there's no migrants from Haiti coming in, and these huge closed containers come in every day, and God knows what's in them.
Well, I think exactly the same as you. It's like we cannot have an immigrant from Haiti coming in because we have to stop them, and there's a whole operation to do that. And so we should focus on whatever really matters. And yes, this is a country of laws. The rule of law is what makes this country strong, and we cannot promote anything different than that. Now, human rights are also very important.
The fact is that's the story. The story is the fact that this is a country based on immigration, that in the year 2012, when we can do any number of things with technology and send, men and women to, the moon and etc., we still have not been able to resolve by laws that make sense and that are actually realistic an immigration policy. That is what is just like, you're kidding me. And it was $28 billion that was given to Boeing to build the fence and the cyber fence. So what happened to that money? That $28 billion. What happened to that money? This notion of the securing of the border is just fascinating to me, because if you really wanted to secure the border, build a glass wall that is 50 feet high and 50 feet below, so it's clear that no one is ever going to be able to scale it. But you build it from one end to the other with only, in other words, go to the extreme. You want the wall, okay, then make the wall so that we can then move beyond the argument already. Because otherwise it's like the wall, and the wall is like ridiculous, right? Because it's like there, and then it's not there, and then it's there, and then it's not there. And it's like, well, okay, if I got to see my daughter, I'm going to go to where I can get across. So build that wall and make the only place where you can cross through by car. And see what happens. See what happens. Because I think that it's the hypocrisy. And I have, when I go and I lecture at many colleges and universities, I love this question. And it's from university students, so they're smart, they're thinking. But the lack of information out there, which is, why don't they just go stand in line and get their papers? Why do they want to be here illegally? Like, why don't they go get their papers? And it's like, there's no place to go. There's no place to go. There's no line to stand in. There's no place. That's the story. So when Lou Dobbs was every night saying, oh, this and this, the story should have been, and what's going on with ICE, and what's going on with Department of Homeland Security, and where's that money, and where's the training, and where's the this, and where's the, if you really want to do that, that's the story. And all our taxpayer dollars.
And also, how many of these people are actually paying taxes?
Right.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Dorothy Villarreal, and I'm a current undergraduate at the college, and I'm also the president of our Mexican-American organization. And last semester, we actually had a conference with students from all over the East Coast about Latinos in the media. And we had two keynote speakers, one of which was Maria Elena Salinas, and she was absolutely brilliant. And we also had Edward Schumacher Matos. And one of the statements that he made that absolutely incensed all of the students was when he said that the students should think of themselves as Americans first before they should consider themselves Latinos. And I thought that was a really interesting statement to make because I think that it shows just the differences of opinions within the Latino community, and also, I mean, like we also deal with like issues of like Latinos versus Latin Americans within the college, and so I'm just wondering what y'all's perspective is on that in terms of just reconciling that fact. Whereas we are Americans, but we are also Latinos, and you know where do these identities?
Do you love more your father or your mother?
I'm sorry?
Do you love more your dad or your mom?
Oh, my mom, definitely.
Oh, that was. Oh, no one's watching that. We hope.
Good for her, but you don't have to choose.
We just did a story, actually. I just did a piece for Weekend Edition about retro-acculturated Latinos. And, you know, the terminologies that we're using now that young people are, you know. I mean, I remember when I got to New York after growing up, being born in Mexico, raised in Chicago, getting to New York when there were no Mexicanos there and just like, where, what? You know, and I went to Macondo bookstore and there was a little pin that said, soy bilingüe, bicultural y orgullosa de mi raza. And I was like, oh my God, I exist! Soy bilingüe, bicultural y orgullosa, I exist! You know, and it was a little pin, you know, and that's like, that, can you imagine? Now there's a conversation which is, we can retro-acculturate, we can be ambicultural, we can be all of it. And that Latinos can actually lead the conversation about having this where we don't have to choose, where it isn't one or the other. Can you handle it? Can you handle it? The fact that we don't need to choose. Like we can live in multiple realities and it's okay, porque podemos hablar español and then we go back to English and it's okay. So, and that, opening up that conversation so that people are like, oh, okay. Again, but we have to be telling those stories. I mean, it's the first story that I know of on a national news network reporting about retro-acculturated Latinos. So, again, we need to be telling the stories for everyone, to broad audiences, so they can understand. Oh.
So, just a quick follow-up to that. So the point that Edward was trying to make was that in order for Latinos to be heard by other Americans, like we had to put ourselves almost like on the same playing field, right? And so, you know, the person like in the news, for example, like they consider themselves American before they consider themselves, you know, of Irish descent, right? And so the point that he was trying to make was that we should think of ourselves as Americans first.
To own that, to take the ownership of what American is.
Right.
That's true too.
So,
but you never know, like, you know, like it's a very fluid thing. My kids, depending on who asks, you know, what are you? Well, I'm a New Yorker, or I'm Dominimex, you know, because my dad's Dominican, my mom is Mexican. You know, I live in Harlem, or soy Mexicano. You know, I'm an American. I think it's very fluid, and I think that that's part of what we're saying is it's also very fluid. I think that what Isaac said, we just don't have to feel like we have to choose. And that might be the story of the futuro, is that we don't have to choose, and it's okay.
Just really quickly, two more questions, the young woman there and then David.
Hi, Hi, my name is Michelle Castillo. I am a master's student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in Education Policy and Management. And my question is, so I love that you talked about being a democracy junkie, and so news is about empowering the community and how that can sometimes be at tension with the business model and ratings. And so how do you, Isaac, balance that responsibility of, you have a responsibility for the business and for the ratings, but then also a responsibility to empower the community. And so how are those at odds, and how do you reconcile those? And then for you, Maria, I was just wondering how working with PBS and NPR has perhaps given you a little bit more journalistic freedom to sort of push the envelope in ways that perhaps being part of a mainstream media news organization might not have given you that space. If you could talk a little bit about that.
That's so sweet that you would think that working with NPR and PBS gives me more journalistic freedom. I guess it does, compared, given the fact that when I was working at CNN, I would have to do things in, a minute 30 or 2 minutes. So yeah, being able to do an hour documentary or a half-hour piece. And at this point, what I've done is I've created my own television series, which is going to run on primetime on PBS in the fall. And it's the first time that a national news program is executive produced and anchored by a Latina woman that I know of, unless on Univision, but then this would be in English. And that's part of the whole raison d'etre, is to say, we as journalists have to be the ones who are making the final decisions. We are the executive producers. We are deciding. We are taking our journalism seriously. I maintain a deep relationship with NPR and PBS because I believe in public media, because it was formed at its core to be representative. And so I am one of those people who at my core believe in that, having worked both in commercial and non-commercial. And also because if Latinos are not watching public television or listening to public radio, there will not be public radio or public television in the future, because no one's going to be sending in those checks. So I'm about making sure that audience gets really broad. And my television series, I guess because I'm executive producing, I can do things like say, you know what? I want animation. I want to use a little bit of animation because our series is called America by the Numbers with Maria Hinojosa, and so it's using data. It's about starting with numbers and telling the story behind that data. And using data in a way, because as a Latina journalist in the mainstream in the United States, there are a number of times when it's like, well, you have some kind of an agenda. You've got a Mexican agenda, you've got an immigrant agenda, you've got a feminist agenda, you've got a short woman's agenda, you've got an agenda. And it's like, no, I'm a journalist. Before I'm American, before I'm Latina, before I'm whatever in my profession, I'm a journalist at my core. And I want to tell these stories. So using animation, we can do that. We're doing long form, we can do that. We're shooting a different style because we're hiring a DP and we can do that. So in that sense, yes, there is a lot more freedom. And we're having a great time at it. Latino USA is about to expand to an hour-long show after celebrating 20 years. So we're just, we're very lucky. Like Isaac, we're very lucky too because we're growing. We're like, wow, what the possibilities, and we're leading the conversation. And how do we reach the millennials, and how do we make sure that the older listeners also get it? So it is a joy. It's also, I'm a journalist that became an entrepreneur. And that was not, it just kind of happened. It's crazy. It's crazy when you get into the whole business side of it. It's just insane. But I feel like I had a real responsibility to do this because it's also about the next generation of young journalists and training them to believe empowered to go into whatever news field, whether it's at the AP or Univision, and to feel empowered and seen and visible in a newsroom.
Good content doesn't have to be boring. That's the first thing. And second, our community is really grateful. When I joined Univision after a couple of months, we did a town hall with the president about education. And they were very afraid to put it on prime time. And it got better ratings than the novela that was there. because they are avid to have that kind of information and content. So that is a concern that I don't need to deal with because the response of the audience is great.
So what I was thinking, if I can do a follow-up, is just more along the lines of like subprime mortgage lending and how it really affected the Latino community, and more. And my parents are Mexican immigrants. I grew up watching Primer Impacto. I actually grew up also watching Conversaciones, but they didn't see the presidential debates until after the novelas, because the novelas were first and then the debates happened after. So they didn't see it in lifetime on Univision. And so I was just wondering, how to ensure that the community, that is like a priority for the community, because I guess the novelas had greater ratings. I don't know.
Well, they saw it. They just didn't see it at that precise time. Point is, we had our own debates in Spanish, in prime time. At what time did we show the English language debate with translation? Maybe it was later. We showed it. And if we want to have the possibility to continue to grow and do new things, we also have to be cognizant that we are in a real company. And the company has owners, and the owners want profits. So it's a responsibility that when you run a news organization, you need to have that balance. And there are times where the only thing that matters is the news, and there are other times where priorities are different, and if it's not as newsworthy or as important, you need to find what's the middle ground.
And David, you have one question?
I'm David Abel. I'm a Nieman Fellow and a reporter from the Boston Globe who spent a few years covering Latin America. And for the record, I'm not a crook.
Yes.
Thanks. George W. Bush in 2004 won about 40% of the Latino vote.
44.
John McCain won, I think, something like 31%. And I think Mitt Romney won 0% or something like that. 27% or something. So my question for you is, have the Democrats, in your eyes, consolidated support in some sort of block kind of way from Latinos? But beyond that, the real question is, what do Republicans, in your eyes, have to do to win back win back Latino support? Is it enough to run a candidate like Marco Rubio? Do you think that would tip the balance? I don't know.
I will leave the Marco Rubio question for my friend Laura, but I can tell you that a couple of good ideas for the Republican Party is stop calling Latinos wetbacks. That doesn't help. Don't promote self-deportation. When there are 30 million people that don't speak English, do not go for English-only documents. There are some things that are just make sense. I think it was Bobby Jindal, the one that said that we cannot be the party of stupid, right? So it's just about that.
No, it was Bush, actually. It was Jeb Bush.
I was Jeb, okay.
Jeb Bush that said we can't be the party of stupid.
Yeah, well, Jeb, unbelievable. Jeb Bush speaks Spanish fluently. Unbelievably good. And he was telling me that one of his sons is married to a girl, I think, from Iran or Iraq. So his granddaughter is actually 25% Canadian, 25% Iraqi, 25% American, and 25% Latina. So that is the face of this country. That is how it's going to look. And so if they cannot find a way to communicate to that audience, to that target group, they're gonna have a problem. Unless there is some plan to have many more white guys there that we don't know of.
Laura, you had the Marco Rubio question.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to directly, I can talk about Marco Rubio for hours, but I think more broadly, I think Democrats are and will be very foolish not to take seriously the notion that they have to continue to work and address issues that are important to Latinos and all Americans, obviously, in order to keep the vote. I think historically, yes, Latinos, like African Americans, have traditionally voted in favor of Democrats, but as we know, it's a lower percentage, and it's changed. And I think there is no reason why it might not change, not in the next election, but in maybe 20 or 30 years, depending on what the policies are. Because yes, there are issues like healthcare and public education that tend to be issues that Latinos tend to support more in line with Democrats, but there's a lot of other issues that they don't. So no, I don't think just because there's a name, is someone going to get elected? But I think actually, if you look at Marco Rubio, some of the policies he supports are also supported by other Latinos. So I think I don't think you can write. I think it would be very foolish to write off strong Republican leaders as simply window dressing for the Republican Party, those who happen to be Latino. And I think the Democrats will get a backlash if they do that.
And David, on the same page of that question, the president now went from 2 members of the cabinet to 1 Latino after 71% of the election vote going to the Democrats. So, I mean, I don't know how well they're reading the signing on the wall. And also, if you look at Democrats, the ones that have promising young leaders are Republicans. I mean, you look at there are 3 Hispanic senators. One is Bob Menendez, and the other 2 are Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, both very, very strong senators. So, I mean, do they understand that they have to work on that? Yes, and Susana Martinez and Brian Sandoval, 2 strong governors that are Republican and Latinos. I mean, they definitely there is a strategy.
I'd like to close by asking each of you to sort of quickly define what success looks like. Do we want to get to the day where the Associated Press does not have a Hispanic affairs writer, where there is no Univision, where Latino USA is not, because these issues and these stories are so completely integrated into what the national narrative is and how mainstream media, whatever that looks like, X years out, are covering, or does it look like something else?
I think the AP could get to a point where they don't have a Hispanic affairs reporter, and I don't think that might be too long. I mean, I think this should now be something that everybody's coming, and I think we've really seen covering, and I think we've really seen a sea change in the last half decade in terms of having it be more on the table. My concrete idea of success is in 2016, when we have 100 years of Puerto Rico as part of the U.S., and we have 100 years of citizens who don't have a vote and can't vote for president, that it is covered throughout mainstream media, and that this becomes a major story. That would be my
I don't know, girl.
definition of success.
Por favor.
I just think it's like, what? She's asking if Isaac wants to say yes and Univision should go away.
I'm not going to say that. No way.
I think it's, we're growing. So Latino USA is growing at this point. And I think that, this thing that we have as journalists and as business members, which is that it's not a political agenda to want diversity in your newsroom, that's got to be a constant push, because again, that's at the core of what democracy looks like, right? It was really, truly representative. So I really hope that our newsrooms are transformed and that they do become truly representative of who we are. So success for me does not mean Latino USA is going away. It may not be Latino USA, but it becomes Futuro USA, but that there's a conversation and an acknowledgement that there's a particular experience of this moment in history that should be documented and that needs to be documented and told. Will we need it, In 50 years, maybe not. Maybe not. I'm okay with that.
Success to me is when we have a women president, a Latino president, and those things are not strange to us. And we are in the right path. I mean, we have an African American as a president, and no one thought that could be possible. Personal success is if Univision continues to grow and Fusion becomes a huge success. But this is a country that surprises you every time you feel that there is no light. And I am positive about the future, and I think that there are new times where people are understanding Latino issues in a different way, being more tolerant, being more understanding, being more business savvy, and at the end of the day, getting to a point where they can relate to Latinos as Americans and not just as another subculture.
Well, success for us at Nieman would be to welcome you all back, and to, when that happens, the conversation has moved so far down the road. We can't even believe that we were sitting here in 2013 talking about language, for instance. And I hope that we get that chance. So to Maria and to Isaac and to Laura, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.